We live in an age of two overwhelming forces, globalization and Google. Both are irresistible. And both are causing, I think, a public assumption that learning languages doesn't matter. Those other people will speak English, globalization, or Google will provide an instant translation. It's a nonsense. And that is the task of our speaker tonight, to prove that it is indeed a nonsense. Natalie Harrington is a young lawyer from Wellington, or based in Wellington now, who has just come back from a Prime Minister's scholarship for Asia, in which she spent 8 weeks studying in Taiwan, in Taipei, at a language school run by the National Taiwan University. It's a very good school. Our MFAT trainees are sent there, for example, and others from the New Zealand government. Natalie is living proof of the value of learning languages. I won't say more about her interesting background, going to live in China in 2001, when you were probably yay high, and all that has followed. So over to you, Natalie. Thank you.
Tēnā koutou katoa， 各位女士们、先生们，谢谢你们今天晚上到这边听我说一些可能有意思的话，不知道。So I'm here tonight to share some thoughts on language learning, the value of language learning, what I've taken away from my own experiences, both historical and recent. And I guess in a word, the message I have tonight is one of needing to be slightly more realistic and nuanced in our approach to describing what it is that New Zealand should be aiming for in terms of its language learning outcomes. So I am really, really grateful to have been invited by CAPE tonight to share these thoughts. I've been to many CAPE events over the last year and a bit and have heard from a range of really incredible speakers with different backgrounds. So I hope that what I have to share tonight can become a valuable contribution to this conversation, because this is becoming a more and more important national conversation, which I'm really heartened to see is featuring in the media a lot more and being taken a lot more seriously. So to begin, I suppose I should introduce myself and what I do now. I work at Russell McVeigh in the corporate advisory space. I'm what they call a Group 2 solicitor, so that means I have approximately 3 years experience. I've had my qualification certificate for a couple of years and can do a bit, but still have a long way to go in the legal profession. Outside of law, however, my interests very much lie in the New Zealand-Asia interaction space, and I have a really keen interest in being involved in all of the work of the Asian New Zealand Foundation, for example. As a member of the leadership network there, I've had some really great opportunities, and now hopefully through the efforts of CAPE we'll see a bit more action in that area. But what I think is probably most important for tonight is the me of 2001, as was mentioned before. So I'm actually from Hamilton originally. I was lucky enough to grow up with a mother who was a keen linguist. She was in fact doing her master's in applied linguistics at Waikato University when I was young. So I had what I now reflect on as a great privilege of being brought up with French and Te Reo Māori being spoken regularly in the home. My father's side of the family is from Cape Verde, Portugal, France and Luxembourg, so we have a whole array of European languages and Cape Verdean Creole in there to boot. So languages and the importance of speaking different languages to communicate with different members of the family has always been really important to me. But in 2001, my mum made what I now reflect on as being a hugely brave decision, and that was to take her 9-year-old daughter, pack a few suitcases and move to Liaoyang County, about an hour-and-a-half drive from Changsha, which is the capital of Hunan province. So that was at a time where very few people seemed to have any understanding of why one would want to go to China. I think my mum had heard a few Radio New Zealand interviews with people at that point opining that perhaps China would become the next big thing, but also India is on the rise, so maybe we should be learning Hindi. Very, very different from the current headlines we see basically weekly. Anyway, 2001, and we are hanging out in the mountains around Sichuan, speaking only Mandarin, unfortunately not really speaking any other dialects by that point, but when you're thrown into that sort of environment as a 9-year-old, you do whatever it takes to be invited to play a game of tiggy with the other kids. There are probably some really qualified linguists in the room who can speak more to the brain development of children, but I am told I was lucky enough to be landed in an immersion environment inside the window where I was still able to learn by acquisition rather than by the process that we are unfortunately later forced to go through as teenagers, memorizing French grammar or whatever other experiences people have had. So it was that need to speak to local people who of course didn't speak English, because for most of them they had never ever seen a foreigner. So just to put this in context, when we arrived, Liaoyang County, despite having about 1.5 million people, had approximately 4 paved roads going out of the town. The bus journey to the completely boarding school environment where my mum taught and we both lived was 20 minutes on completely potholed mud road that got shut for a couple of months in winter, and you had to walk around if you wanted to get into the town to buy anything. People in my school would look at me and try to put me in a box, because that's what kids do. You try to make people familiar so that you can engage with them. One kid in the nearby village who attended the school was albino. And now the kids had heard of Russia, they'd heard of Japan, most of them had heard of America. They knew I wasn't from any of those places. They knew after about a year that I sounded just like them. So the logical conclusion for most of them was that, oh, it's a second albino kid. She's just like us. Anyway, that China is a world away from the China I regularly get to visit now, where, as you say, Google and globalization are key. Well, globalization is key, Baidu is also key. So I had 3 years in what was largely an immersion environment. Our 18 months in Hunan province consisted of mainly associating with other local children and occasionally bumping into the other 3 Westerners who lived in that county, which was a county of 1.5 million. So pretty infrequent chances to use English outside the home with my mother. So what does that lead to a little further down the track? I came back to New Zealand to go to high school. We had moved from Hunan to Fujian and were living in Fuzhou, where there were some international schools, but my mother wasn't so keen to send me there. She had various reasons for that, and I ended up coming back to Hamilton. However, being a teenager and then a young university student who spoke this weirdly southern central brand of Chinese brought a whole lot of opportunities. One of which was to go back to China representing Victoria University at Hanyu, which some of you may be familiar with, the annual Chinese bridge competition that sees people singing and dancing live on television. This was all very much to my surprise when Victoria University sent me as the rep. I thought I was going to attend a pure speech competition where I would prepare a 5-minute persuasive speech on a topic selected by the judges, but no such luck. Other highlights throughout university was the constant opportunity to engage with really interesting people and to be invited to participate in discussions and events that would normally be so far out of the reach of a first or second year BA student. So for instance, when in 2010 the then Vice President Xi Jinping came, I was invited by Victoria University again to be part of a group of students who would have an interview with him and sort of talk to him about the language learning opportunities here in New Zealand. That was then sidetracked when we realised we both went to the same place on holiday occasionally when I used to go to Gulanyu, which some of you might be familiar with. So small things like that at the time seemed completely insignificant. I was a first year university student who took my background for granted and didn't question what those series of opportunities might mean later in life. In fact, I didn't even really know who Xi Jinping was at that stage, much to everyone else's shock. So, silly TV programs aside, this ability to speak another language has since crystallized in my mind as being a really valuable tool, and that is enforced weekly by the sort of growing dialogue in New Zealand around New Zealand's lack of people with good language skills in other areas. So a lot of people had sort of said to me, well, why aren't you in the Chinese business space more? You're a lawyer, you're working with clients from all over the world. We often have clients whom we help with overseas investment office applications, for example. Why aren't you using your Chinese more? Because you speak it. And the thing I kept butting up against was there was a complete mismatch in my understanding of where my language was at versus what other people perceived my abilities to include. So I was always adamant, no, I can't speak Chinese in a meeting with foreign business people because I might mess up the translation of one legal word. I might understand, I might incorrectly think that when they say the auditor, they're actually just talking about a generic accountant, and that would be the end of the world. So no, I'm not going to let myself go into those situations. On reflection, and after a few meetings where I was just forced into a room with people and told to go for it, I decided, okay, if this is going to be the future of my working life, then I really need to actually bone up on those technical skills. Hence my recent application to the Prime Minister's Scholarship for Asia, and the reason I'm here tonight to share some thoughts. So, the reason I knew about the Prime Minister's Scholarship for Asia was through an initial opportunity to go to Beijing and Shanghai in 2016 with the Ministry of Youth Development. They took a group of 10 young New Zealanders, mostly entrepreneurs running their own startups, over to China to participate in the NZ China Youth Forum. I still have a feeling I was taken because of my language abilities, not because having a lawyer on the delegation was a particular bonus. But at that point, a lot of people started mentioning, oh, the PMSA. And for about a year afterwards, I had lots of people sort of say, have you thought? Anyway, earlier this year, I decided, right, it's time to bite the bullet and see what I can do. So, on the advice of some friends who are currently with MFAT and in the ICLP over at National Taiwan University, I got in touch with the school and said, look, this is my set of abilities, this is what I want to be able to do, can you create anything around that? Now, this school is incredible. They deal exclusively with really, really high-performing Western students of Chinese language. They were set up originally in partnership with Stanford University back in the early 60s. They cater largely to American students still, but since 98 or 99 have been hosting New Zealand, future New Zealand diplomats as well. And they came back and said, whatever you want, we'll create it. It'll be completely one-on-one. It'll cost you, but if you can pull the funding together, you're welcome to come. So I am still so grateful to the Prime Minister's Scholarship for Asia people, whoever they are out there who were on that panel that chose the recipients, because the 8 weeks I got to spend in Taipei were some of the most challenging but the most rewarding of my entire language learning journey. I arrived in Taipei knowing that the program would be difficult. I had heard horror stories from MFATers saying that their 2-year program just destroyed some of them, that they went from 0 to being able to interpret high-level diplomatic meetings within 2 years, and that was because they never got a moment's sleep. And so I was expecting it to be bad. What I was not expecting was it to turn into 12-hour days sometimes. My mornings involved 5 hours of one-on-one classes, which then necessitated about 5 to 7 hours of homework to prepare for the next day's class. The program included about 3 hours a day of grammar and writing, which, being someone who can maintain a conversation to a pretty high level, I didn't think I needed 3 hours a day of grammar and writing, but turns out I did. And interestingly enough, I was eventually convinced to add classical Chinese into the program. And I mean, for some of you this might make perfect sense, but to me when I arrived, I said, no, I'm here to become more technically proficient. I want to learn business-focused Chinese. And while that was an aspect of the program, I now see the value of that classical Chinese element. Now, of course, 8 weeks isn't a huge amount, but with the intensity and pace that the teachers were progressing things, we were able to cover a huge amount of material and sort of worked through textbook 1 of the ICLP Classical Chinese course. The reason being that, well, a couple of teachers raised examples like this. They said if you're in a high-level meeting of any kind in a Western context with people discussing what policies should be implemented, how business decisions should be formulated and made, you're going to have people using informal language, a mix of formal language, but also frequent smatterings of literary references. It's something I hadn't really reflected on and have since been picking up on a lot more in the context of work, just how often people reference characters from books we should all know, or Shakespearean references, or even idioms that I don't even think of as idioms anymore because they're such a regular part of speech that I've never actually stopped to ask why we talk like that. And they said, it doesn't matter how good your business Chinese skills are. It doesn't matter how quickly you can digest the financial section of the newspaper. If you can't pick up on the references to characters in Hong Lo Meng, or if you can't pick up on specific Confucian quotes that are brought into someone's argument to strengthen their proposition, then there's no difference between you and someone who's just learnt for a couple of years at university. So that's the point I got to that really made me start thinking about the need to be realistic about our language learning. Because there is a certain depth in our understanding of a language and culture that's necessary before you can really say that your additional language is of use to you, your workplace, or New Zealand generally. I get really excited that more and more people are saying we need to support more young people to learn language. We need to have a stronger focus on Asian languages. And I'm also encouraged by the frequent posts I see on social media saying, oh, I've just come out of a course learning about Chinese business etiquette and it's really helped me in my recent meetings. There's so much of that sort of stuff on LinkedIn at the moment. But I think a lot of people are being overly optimistic about the speed with which they can get to that level. And I think they're underestimating the dedication and commitment that needs to go into that process to be able to get there. And what I've seen recently is an increase in exaggerated claims of people coming out of university with a degree that includes a major in a language. But these students saying, yep, I did 3 years of Chinese, or I did 3 years of Korean or Japanese, and so I can work in an environment with people from that culture. In some cases, in all cases, that is going to be helpful. But what I'm becoming quite wary of is the absolute quality that comes with those statements. And it's made me, at first, a little pessimistic about the sort of view on where we might be going. But I do see a lot of opportunities to further the discussion and try and bring people's minds around to this, just so that a few more people start questioning where we need to get to before we stop. In preparing to come here today, I had a chat with Anne French, and we were laughing about how when it comes to learning a language, there are so many ways to fall off the horse. Not that many to get back on. So I know that I come from a really privileged background where language learning has always been a part of life. I know that so many students struggle through secondary school with maintaining an interest in language. Not to mention it's really hard, but when you have parents saying, well, how's that going to help you get a job, and other unhelpful attitudes like that, it is really difficult to maintain the time commitment so that you can achieve that depth. So I guess one of the messages here, and it is a very obvious one, is start the process early and do anything you can to keep the process going. The next thing I kind of want to talk about, though, is what is the logical next step if that is true, that people are underestimating the time and commitment it takes to get to a level of speaking a second language so that it is actually useful. And what I've seen in the last couple of years is that there is this proliferation of funding available to support language learners, but that perhaps we need to take a step back and assess how we're allocating that funding, what kinds of language learning we're supporting. So, and I'm aware that I'm in the presence of a lot of people who might be involved in those decisions. So this is purely from my own experience and sort of conversations with friends who have received funding for language learning. But what I've found as a university student was that the universities were full of incredibly passionate lecturers in the language departments. I was a student in the Spanish and Chinese departments at Victoria, very underfunded. The faculties were getting smaller and smaller each year, the teachers were going. The external support all came in a rather ad hoc way from governments of countries where those are the native languages. And with a range of success, I personally found the Confucius Institute programs quite tedious and hard to engage with in a meaningful way. The second aspect to all of this is that there is a lot of ways for people to go and get a taste of other languages and cultures. It's really, really easy nowadays to go on an exchange for 6 to 12 months. And I've seen a lot of people, and actually have seen a lot of CVs of people saying, I speak this, and further down the CV you'll see they've done 2 years of that language at university and a 6-month exchange. Now for some languages that might be enough to get a good grasp. For many it is not, which raises a question of how much our employer is actually thinking about these issues. So where I think we've got to is that there is a mismatch between what we know and what we know we need, which is more people who can speak other languages, which we all know is beneficial. So there's a mismatch between that knowledge and what we currently provide, or what is easily available to students. Because what I see as lacking is support for students who do want to deepen their understanding or grasp of a language. In applying for the funding to go to ICLP, which was a significant amount of money, I was told repeatedly, don't bother. It's too much money. People are more willing to fund young people with less exposure to foreign languages so that we increase our base of people with a little bit of Chinese or a little bit of Spanish. And what you're asking for is too much. You already have Chinese to a really good level. Look elsewhere. I'm really glad I didn't listen to that advice. I mean, I looked for other funding sources for something like this, but actually the PMSA is the perfect sort of funding pool for exactly this kind of study. So I'm, thankful to all the people who told me not to listen to the people telling me no. So I personally don't have the ideas for the solutions for those kind of projects. If we're looking at deepening people's understanding, of course you're going to come up against the risk that those people will move overseas immediately once they attain that level and depth of understanding. People who can say they are trilingual and can work at a really proficient level in a professional setting in 2 or 3 languages are really valuable in a multitude of countries. So I can see on the one hand that there might be a reticence to move funding towards that area in case we lose those people. One of the core parts of the application for the Prime Minister's scholarship is how are you going to use this learning experience to benefit New Zealand, which is important, so you want to keep the people here. In any case, I think what needs to happen is an honest conversation about our limitations as people and how long it can take to learn something new. I hope that we get to a point where someone can come back from a year's exchange to Beijing and say, yep, I learned a great foundation, but I'm not going to claim I'm fluent. I've had so many examples in the last few years of people completely overblowing their own abilities, and that's had an interesting effect in reverse. So, for example, I think those quite grandiose claims about our abilities are becoming more and more normal, so that when someone says, yep, I have working proficiency level Mandarin, Chinese, Hindi, whatever, people sort of push back and say, oh, but have you learnt to write the characters? They're really hard. It's like, well, I don't think anyone should be claiming to have working proficiency level language in anything if they can't read or write. But the fact that that pushback is happening is indicative of a tendency in young people to say, yep, I put in a year or two, and I'm pretty confident that I can nail that. The other aspect of our need for honesty around our own limitations has to be also that understanding a language does not necessarily mean you understand the culture. And I had a fascinating example at ICLP recently of a young American student taking a year out of his postgraduate studies to improve his Chinese, and his Chinese was fantastic. He was a really, really hard worker who had studied from the beginning of high school, had about 9-10 years under his belt. I think a real gift for language learning. This person had never ever lived in a Chinese-speaking place prior to coming to Taipei. So the fact of his incredible language level is amazing. What he didn't have, though, was any ability to understand cultural nuance. And this person was a little eccentric, really, really did not like the Chinese government, was very, very vocal about that. And that's fine, your political views are your own. What he then missed was a lot about other people that meant he often put his foot into it in conversations. So for example, a lot of the teachers at ICLP are from mainland China, and like a lot of young people in their 20s and 30s who want to do well in the workplace, these teachers are party members. Now, they didn't need to say that explicitly for a lot of us to pick up on that. Their anecdotes about their working lives so far often gave little hints that, okay, if they've progressed that quickly during their career, if by 35 they had a management role within a government ministry in mainland China, they've probably got some affiliation. Their political views don't come into it. It's just a reality of working in China. It seems to be a pragmatic decision that a lot of young professionals make. He did not pick up on any of this and would forget that the people he was talking to were from mainland China, and would again and again and again start slagging off the Chinese government in his perfect Chinese with his beautiful tones. So I think, yeah, that's just a good reminder that we can claim that language learning helps us understand another culture and therefore helps us build trusting relationships and have more robust discussions and do better business deals, but that's not necessarily the case. Look, I don't want to be completely doom and gloom about this all. I know these last couple of examples are a bit down on everything. I just think it's a really timely reminder, given all of the discussions right now around introducing compulsory language learning in schools, to sort of step back and go, okay, what is it we actually want to achieve? If we want to achieve teaching New Zealanders a little bit more about other cultures so that they just are a little more open-minded, then that's fantastic, but we shouldn't overblow it. A final little example from ICLP was actually a fellow New Zealand student who, to his credit, has gone from 0 to being able to handle himself really well in a professional setting in 18 months. Said something to me over lunch in Chinese one day, and he got a tone wrong. And the way he got the tone wrong meant that there were two possible and both quite viable interpretations of what he was trying to say, both with quite different meanings. And I paused and I looked at him and I said, do you really think? I didn't get to finish the sentence. He just said, oh, what I said was, and decided in that moment I couldn't speak Chinese. I was here as a complete beginner, and wrote me off after that point, which I thought was also just a again, an interesting contrast in the way people value their own abilities, because when you're in an environment like that, you're often told every day, oh my gosh, you're so great. The teachers are really good at praising you and building the students up, but sometimes that can get to people's heads a little. Anyway, putting all of that aside, I think at the end of the day, I am really, really encouraged by my peers' attitude towards the value of language in the workplace and what it will mean for our careers. I'm still really junior in terms of entering the professional services world, and saying to our bosses we want to take time off to deepen our language understanding can butt up against a few question marks still, but I think that's going away. And I really do think that with a little bit more nuanced thinking around what we want to achieve and what we want to be able to say New Zealanders are capable of, then the outlook is great. And with more and more recognition of the growing young population that is bilingual, trilingual, or even more than that, and the acknowledgement that we need to harness that ability and not let it peter out during school when people are only taught English with a smattering of French, then we might actually get to a place where we can say, yes, New Zealanders are really open to learning other languages, learning about other cultures, and they do understand the value of that more broadly. So I don't know whether I have dispelled the myth of Google being the answer, but that's all I have to say. So thank you for listening.